On behalf of Chulalongkorn University, I'd like to welcome all the mentors and all the participants to this workshop and this morning's lectures. We are very fortunate to receive assistance from the Social Science Research Councils, or SSRC, a U.S. nonprofit organization, in organizing the lectures we are having this morning, which are parts of the writing workshop for international publication. Sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation, in 2018, the Social Science Research Council launched a Global Scholars Initiative, a multi-pronged effort to strengthen the English language writing skills of Asian scholars working in Asian institutions and increase their success in publishing articles in English medium journals. Under the Global Scholars Initiative, the SSRC have been organizing a series of workshops to help junior scholars in Asia develop manuscripts for international publication. The workshops focus on strategies and methods to overcome obstacles Asian scholars face when submitting English language materials to highly ranked publication. And on behalf of Chulalongkorn University, I would like to thank the Social Science Research Council and the Henry Luce Foundation for the help to make this event possible. And the sincere thanks also go to all the mentors who have traveled to Bangkok and diligently prepared these lectures and workshops. I hope you all will benefit from this workshop. And without further ado, may I give the floor to Dr. H Kratoska.
Good morning. Okay, I trust you can all see the slides well enough. This is a talk about getting published. And I'm delivering this talk because I have been on both sides of getting published. I spent around 25 years as an academic, writing my own articles, sending them off, getting them rejected. And so I know exactly what you're going through on that side of things. I've also edited a journal, and what? The micro, okay, never mind, I'll use this one. Okay, this better? Yeah, okay. I've also edited a journal, and I've run a university press, so I've seen it from the side of the editors and from the side of a publisher. Let's start with a question. What is the main thing that editors want? And I would guess if I went around this room and asked each one of you, no one would come up with the answer that I'm going to give you. Because generally speaking, people think editors are looking for new, exciting information, things like that. But in fact, the main thing that editors are looking for is readers. Because there's no point in publishing something unless someone's going to read it. So editorial discussions very often start with the question, who is going to read this? And I would have to say that quite often if the answer is we don't think very many people are going to read it, we might stop right there. So one of the things you need to be doing is writing for an audience, a particular audience. And you need to pick journals or publishers that serve that audience. So the logical question after that, if editors are looking for readers, is what do readers want? And again, I think if I went around the room, I'd get a variety of answers, but I think fundamentally what readers want is answers to questions. These could be questions that you already have in mind, something from your own research, but also sometimes when you read an abstract or a title, you look at that and you say, that's interesting, I'd like to read about that. And it's important that you think of that because what you're doing when you put together an article, you put the title, you put an abstract, that is an advertisement for what you're doing. So research generally starts with questions. And the first set of questions that you deal with are questions about facts. And a lot of research is accumulating facts. The next thing you do is you follow up with questions of why and how. And generally speaking, the factual questions may be new information, but it's not terribly interesting without asking why did that happen or how did that happen. Let me just take something simple. Take an election. Who won the election? Well, fine, this person won the election, but the interesting question is, how did they do it? Why did that person win and the other person lose? The answers to these questions, the why and the how questions in particular, are arguments. And good papers begin with good questions and are built around arguments. So during this talk this morning, I'm going to deal with two things. There'll be two parts. The first is, what do editors look for in a manuscript, and what makes a manuscript successful? And the second part will be about writing for publication. In other words, what can you do in your paper that will satisfy an editor? So how does publishing work? Well, of course, you send in a manuscript. And the first thing that will happen is that it will either be rejected or sent on for further consideration. Now, an immediate rejection is generally known as a desk rejection. And unfortunately, we've gone around doing these workshops in a number of countries in East and Southeast Asia. And frequently, people come up to us and say, I submitted an article to a journal. 1 week later, I got rejected. And what that tells you immediately is that was a desk rejection. That article was not sent out for review because the editor looked at it and found something about it that was wrong, that was going to tell the editor this will not be successful. Sometimes it's an inappropriate topic. What I mean by that, I edited the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and we defined Southeast Asia as pretty much the present set of ASEAN nations. That doesn't include Bangladesh. So Burma sits right beside Bangladesh. We published articles on Burma. We did not publish articles on Bangladesh. And so if somebody sent an article in on Bangladesh, it was immediately rejected. So inappropriate topic. Sometimes people work on a topic that seems unimportant. If you're working on a topic that is obscure, you have to find a way to make it important for other people. And I'll talk about that a bit later. Maybe there's no argument. And a lot of people just dump out all the facts that they've discovered. There's this big heap of facts, and you're kind of left as an editor with saying, you're supposed to do something with this. The author hasn't done anything. You're supposed to poke through those facts and figure out what's going on. That doesn't work. Sometimes the paper is out of date. In fact, I received a paper not too long ago, and I looked at the sources. The most recent source was 1996. And I immediately knew what happened. I looked up that author and discovered that the author had gotten their PhD in 1996, which means they finally, 20 years later, they pulled out a chapter from the PhD and sent it off without revising it. It's a good way to get rejected. Sometimes the writing is really bad, and you look at a piece and you think, trying to turn this into good writing is just going to be more work than I can put into it. Sometimes the structure is not good, and sometimes it just doesn't seem authoritative. And what I mean by that, almost any topic you pick, other people will have worked on it. And what you have to do is to fix a connection between what they have done and what you're doing. If you ignore what everyone else has done, then you can't really say you're writing with authority. Okay, so what about further consideration? Well, at this stage, if an editor sees a strong original argument and thinks readers will be interested, the likelihood is it will go on for peer review. So let's go back to desk rejections for just a minute. They're largely based on the title, the abstract, and key words. In other words, the editor is not going to read all the details in your article at this stage. The editor is also likely to look at the introduction, the conclusion, the headings and the subheadings, and the mechanics, meaning look at the citations, look at the bibliography. Is it professionally done? And a desk rejection may be based primarily on that, because the editor may not be a specialist in exactly the things that you've done. So the editor is more concerned about your argument, what you're hoping to accomplish with the paper. The question of whether you've done a good job of it will be up to the peer review. Okay, if you get to go on for further consideration, you go through peer review. International referee journals normally use a minimum of 2 reviewers. And these reviews are generally done double-blind, which means that you will not know who the referee is, the referee will not know who you are. And understand it is, at least with most English language journals, it's an adversarial process. That is, the referee is going to attack, is going to challenge what you have in your article. Now, they're not doing this out of meanness. They're doing it to be sure that you have a strong case, that you've done a good job of putting this thing together. Because it's much better if there's a weakness, it's much better that it's caught at that stage than to have the article published and then have people criticizing you or your article because something is wrong. I have a friend, a Thai scholar who actually is at Chula, and she was telling me one day that she had sent an article, this is just after she got her PhD, and she had sent an article or manuscript off to a journal, and it came back with criticism. And she said, I was just so deeply hurt by that criticism that I couldn't go back and revise that paper. Well, everybody's hurt by criticism. And particularly when you've put a lot of effort into a paper and then somebody criticizes it, of course you feel hurt. And what you need to do at that point, you look at the referee's comments, you put them aside, and you wait a few days. And then you can go back to them and be objective about it. And do understand that the referees are not being difficult. And they may be wrong, but you need to objectively look at what they've had to say and then set about revising your paper. Now, this is a common thing. I'm not suggesting at all that it's peculiar to Thailand. The editor of the Journal of Asian Studies told me that they often send out reports to authors saying, well, we like this paper, but it's got these problems. So if you revise it, you resubmit it, there's a good chance we'll publish it. And they never hear back. Now, this is a very high prestige journal. And they've said to the author, we're interested in your paper. And yet the author doesn't come back. And I think, again, it's this feeling that, wow, this is too difficult, I've been criticized, I don't want to go through that anymore. But that is the process. Okay, let's say you go through peer review. Now the options are going to be rejection or revise and resubmit. So the rejection will not be based entirely on the peer review reports. That's only part of the process. The editor is going to look at those reports. If you had 2 reports that were very strongly negative, that might doom the paper. But generally you don't get that. Generally the referees will say, well, there's this that's good, there's this that's not so good. I would recommend against or for publication. And then that throws it back in the hands of the editor. What are you going to do about this? So the editor may consult with other people and say, well, I've got this paper, it's about this topic. Is this a particularly important topic in the field right now? At the end of the day, though, the rejection is based on editorial judgment. It's just that the editor will use the referee's reports as part of that process, but also other considerations. Okay, revise and resubmit. Well, then you'll march on to revisions. And they might be minor revisions, they might be major revisions. What kind of questions are reviewers asked? Well, there's a list of the kind of thing that gets sent out. And I won't read through them all, but you can see the kind of question that the referees are being asked to consider. Now, what happens if referees disagree? Well, sometimes you have one report that is very brief. It may say yes or it may say no, but you don't really feel like the referee has engaged with the paper. And a second report, which may be very detailed, the referee clearly has thought hard about this. So that report is going to be more persuasive. So let's say you have one weak positive and one strong negative. You may feel, okay, I'm going to stop here. We'll just reject the paper. Or you could call for a third report. So what kind of issues do the reviewers raise in response to those questions? Well, again, there's a fairly long list, and these are actual examples that I've come across. So you might say, have really good data, but you don't have an argument, or the argument isn't supported. You might have page after page after page of a literature review. Or you might have not enough of a literature review, so that what you're saying is not brought into the context of the literature. If the significance of the article isn't explained, that's a problem. If you have just description, just a pile of data, that's a problem. If you haven't used appropriate theory, that's a problem. If you haven't spelled out your conclusions, if you look through the text and it doesn't move along logically, that's a problem. And once in a while there's a paper and you read the sentences. I mean, I'm not talking about simple grammar here. I'm just talking about sentences that are really hard to understand. And that can also be a problem. So the decision, as I said, is partly based on the reports, partly on other things. But some of the considerations are, how many articles does a journal have on hand? So if there's a big backlog and an article that is not really strongly supported, it might get rejected, even though it's a pretty good piece. You compare the significance of the article, of your article, with other submissions. Okay, has the topic been covered recently by the journal? This can work in two ways. Sometimes there's a topic that has set off a discussion, and your paper might be contributing to that discussion, and that can be a positive. On the other hand, let's just say with the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, we would publish articles on religion. So let's say we do a special issue on, say, Thai Buddhism. Okay, somebody comes along a few months later and says, well, I've got an article on Thai Buddhism. That's not a good time to go there because we've just devoted a special issue to this. But the journal also deals with Islam, it deals with Christianity, and it deals with topics other than religion. So in that case, if we had done a special issue on Thai Buddhism, we wouldn't want to take another article until some time had passed. How much editorial work is going to be involved? And by this, I'm talking about the copy editing. I would suspect that just about everybody in this room and anybody who might be listening would have difficulty writing a perfectly formed English paper. with no need for corrections. The question for the editor then is how much correction is going to be necessary. And finally, who's going to read it? So revise and resubmit is a painful outcome, but it's also a very good outcome. Okay, so that's the end of the first part. Now I'm going to talk about how you write for publication. In other words, I've explained a bit about the process, what the editor is going to be doing with your article when it comes in. And now what I want to do is talk about what you can do to get past that initial hurdle. I mean, particularly, it would be good if you can avoid a desk rejection and get it to the point where somebody's going to look at your data rather than how you've organized your paper. Okay, so let's consider research and writing. So research begins with questions, and it ends with answers, and the answers are based on the evidence that you've come up with. Writing begins with answers, and it ends with proof based on evidence. The problem is many people begin their writing the same way they begin their research. And they want to drag the readers through all the painful process. Now, I know it's painful. I've done it. But you don't have to subject your readers to the same pain. After you've done your research, you should have answers to questions. And when you write an article, basically you pick one question and answer it. So research is confusing, it's disorderly. And I've sat, like I think most of you, with a big pile of material in front of me and thinking, what do I do with this? I mean, how do I make sense of it? But that is precisely the job that you're doing, is making sense of confusing sets of material. And your writing needs to be clear and it needs to be orderly. So readers don't need to follow all the steps. You have reached a point now where you understand it, now you tell other people about it. Okay, there are different sorts of papers that you can produce, and you need to decide early on what kind of paper you're writing. And there's a list here of possibilities, thanks to my colleague Paul Nerney, who's going to be part of the workshop. It could be an empirical study, a case study, methodological study. You start with a hypothesis. Could be something based on theory. It could be a state of the field. Most of you are going to be doing an empirical study or a case study or maybe something that begins with a hypothesis. And you then need to plan your paper. And the first question you need to answer is, why are you writing it? And unfortunately, these days, the honest answer is because my department expects it, because my university expects me to write this paper. And if I don't write it, I'm going to lose my job or I won't get promoted. And honestly, that's not the right answer. The right answer needs to be, it's very simple, because I have something to say. Now, if you have something to say and you write the paper, it also satisfies your department, so it's not an either-or situation. But you really need to be writing a paper because you have something to say. So look at your research material. What can I say? Work out the question you're answering in the paper. And you only are getting one. You really can't write an answer to 3 or 4 questions as the main thing the paper is doing. You pick out one question, you work out the answer to that. You can answer other questions along the way, but the paper has to be focused on the answer to a single question. And then, what is the answer? Now, it's a funny thing. You talk to people about their research, and you ask them, and I'm talking of the experience we've had in these workshops before, you say, what is your research question? And a lot of people will say what their topic is. Now, what is a question? A question ends with a question mark. And it begins with a word like what, or why, or how. So, first of all, work out a research question that really is a question. Okay, then we get to that point, we say to people, what's your answer? And the tendency is to give you a very, very long answer. But you really need to be able to give the answer. If you've thought through your question, you need to be able to give a short answer. I've worked through this material. This is the answer. So back to the politician who's won election. Why did he win election? Well, you list 4 or 5 factors. He had more money to spend. He was a celebrity. The other side had a big scandal. Whatever they are. But the beauty of this is, once you've come up to that point, once you've listed those things, you've outlined your paper. Because the paper is going to say, okay, this guy won election because of these factors, 1, 2, 3, 4. And immediately the reader knows, in the paper I'm going to see a discussion of money, of celebrity, and so on. So you work out your question, you find your answer, and your paper from that point on should be pretty easy to write. And of course you have to support your answer, and you have to, as you think about the question you're going to answer, you also think about how you're going to support it. And that includes supporting it in a way that will be easy for your audience to understand where you're going. And again, I get part of this from my colleague Paul Nerney. You footnote things, you cite them, which is what I just did, right? Okay, so what is your audience? Well, you'll have a primary audience, which is basically the researchers who are working on the same topic or who are in the same field or maybe in related fields. You have a secondary audience, which you would like to attract. And that secondary audience is researchers outside of your field or other professionals. So some people write academic papers that are of interest to NGO workers or to government officials. Now, the way you write for somebody who is exactly in your field is probably a bit different from writing for somebody who's not. We've had discussions with scholars in Japan who say, well, I'm a professional, I write for people who are in my field, so I don't need to give the background. And if you don't give the background, then you cut out people who are not precisely in your field. And bearing in mind that what an editor is looking for is a piece that will attract readers, you don't want to cut possible readers out. So what you want to do is direct your writing to one audience, and you pick that audience, but try to make it accessible to other readers. So how do you find your audience? How do you figure out where you should go? Well, in fact, journals will tell you this is what we want, and often this is what we don't want. So some journals are very broad. And some are much narrower in what they ask for. So something like, say, the Journal of Asian Studies. It takes papers on Asia, which is pretty big already. And it doesn't specify discipline. So it does papers on literature, it does papers on politics, it does papers on economics, long list. They do not do papers that are highly technical. And that kind of paper ought to go to a much more narrowly focused journal. Some journals will emphasize theory, and some are much more interested in the data. Some have special features, so comparative studies in society and history. Journal of Asian Studies, there you have a geographical focus, and again, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. Some have a disciplinary focus. The American Political Science Association, for example, has a journal that is, of course, focused on politics. Some favor technical studies, and some cater to non-specialists. So figure out your audience, and then figure out what you're trying to put into the paper. Are you putting a lot of technical information, or are you able to write something more broadly? And then look for a journal that will publish the kind of article that you're going to write. But whatever it is, you write with an audience in mind, and you write with a journal in mind. And so how do you shape the text? Well, fundamentally, you have an introduction where you explain what the work is going to do. And this really needs to include the argument. It's not enough just to say, this is my topic. You don't hold back your argument to the end of the paper. Okay, here's my information, and okay, I'm reading through this information. Where is it all going? Finally, at the end of the paper, you announce your grand conclusion. Don't do it that way. So you promise the reader something in the introduction, and then you write in the body of the paper exactly what you've promised. And your conclusion, you simply summarize what you have done. So the conclusion is not the place to spring surprises on your reader. You need a core idea. Basically, you've got your research question, and you've got the answer to that. And that is your core idea. And that is what moves people through the manuscript. The argument is the point you're making about the core idea, and then you have your supporting details. And then you write, you rewrite, and rewrite, and rewrite. So sometimes you go through your piece and you read it, you step back from it a bit, and you read it holistically. You're trying to see something about the ideas. So you might read heading by heading, or say, okay, here's this paragraph, it's about this, the next one, and so on. Make sure that from that perspective, your paper makes sense. And then you read it sentence by sentence to see about the grammar, to see if what you're doing makes sense there, if each sentence is followed by another sentence that's logical. And you do it over and over and over again. So I've had people who've said to me, I rewrote this paper 4 times. Well, here's, maybe you can't see it too clearly, but you can see those sheets of paper, which are all heavily annotated. And here's another one that's annotated, and the stack of paper is 2 inches high. So the author of that paper clearly had a lot of time and effort put into revising. And it's my paper, so I can attest to that. Okay, then you have the title, the abstract, and the key words. Now I put this after what I had said about putting the paper together, because that's when you come up with your title, that's when you come up with your abstract and your key words. You have to know what you're saying before you can give it a title, before you can prepare an abstract. And these are very important precisely because most everything now is online. And people are doing their research through Google searches or through other databases that are available through your library. And these search engines pick up what's in the title, the abstract, and the key words. I'm sure everybody has had the experience, you're looking for something, and what comes up on the screen is those 3 things, the author's name. And you have the option, if you're at a university, probably of going to the university library and being able to access that article. And if you're not at a university, you have the option of paying $40 US maybe for a copy of the article. Or nowadays, maybe just for temporary access to the article. But the point is, as a writer, you pay a lot of attention to the title, to the abstract, and the keywords. Because they're visible during the online searches, but also because thinking that through helps you focus your thinking. It helps you focus your writing. And it advertises your work to other people. It attracts readers. So the other major elements you need to think about, your headings and your subheadings. The opening and closing paragraphs, the citations, and the literature review. So the title, what do you put into a title? Well, somehow you'd like to suggest what your argument is. You need to position your material in time and place. So if you're writing about Thailand, you probably need to put either Thailand or some other word that indicates it's about Thailand in the title. And likewise, if it's contemporary, if it's historical, you need to indicate that. You have to do all this in the space of about 10 or 12 words. You should avoid jargon. You should avoid obscure terminology. Don't be clever or cute. You have all these titles there's a whole series of these things that came out, and somebody had discovered a way that they could put parentheses around part of the word, and it suggested another word, and don't do it. I know we're boring editors, but editors don't like it too much. And for abbreviations, if an abbreviation really is well known, something like UN, you don't have to necessarily spell out United Nations. Something like KMT, well, it depends on what your audience is. If they're all going to know what the KMT is, fine. And the problem with a term like that, if you put Kuomintang, well, maybe people don't know what that is either. So be careful with the abbreviations, but also the terms. The abstract is a very short, 150 to 200 word summary of an article. And in the abstract, you need to state the research topic, answer the research question, indicate the significance of the research, and it should stand alone. In other words, somebody having read the abstract should know pretty much what the article says. Now, does that mean they're not going to read the article? Well, for some people, yes. That's all they need to know right now. But anybody who wants to know some details, okay, they know what the article has, and they can go to the article and get those details. What it should not do is try to describe the existing literature. Your literature search can be in the paper, but don't try and put that stuff into the abstract. Don't explain or criticize the work of other writers in the abstract. And don't load it up with a lot of details. I've seen a lot of abstracts which essentially are saying, this article will describe A, B, C, certain points. It's not a good way to proceed. You say, based on my study of A, B, and C, I conclude that, and then you state your conclusion. Put it up there in the front. And then I find these things very frustrating. People are being modest. Okay, in this manuscript, I attempt to show, or I try to prove. But please, if you haven't shown it, or if you haven't proved it, you're not ready to write. So what I'd rather see you say is, in this article, I show, or I argue. So the keywords. Keywords are really a problem because it's hard to figure out what you should pick. But you do start by understanding what a keyword does. It is designed to attract readers, It's designed to guide online searches. It needs to be specific. Okay, I said in your title you should mention Thailand if you're writing about Thailand. But Thailand is not a good keyword, because how many articles are you going to get if you put in Thailand, a search for Thailand? So the keyword should be terms that are often used in your article. And if you have something like World Health Organization, you should probably put in both that and WHO, because people may search on one or the other. If you go online, there's lots of advice about keywords, so do a Google search and see what you find. Well, what you do after you have made your selection of keywords, go to something like Google Scholar, put in that keyword, and see what comes up. See if the articles that that word produces are similar to your article, because that's a good guide as to whether you have an effective keyword. The headings. Your headings really should outline your article. And for an editor, they're important because if I read through just the headings, I should be able to understand how the author has grouped the ideas and how the argument is progressing, step by step. They also allow readers to be selective in what they read. Because frequently, somebody will look at an article and say, well, I'm interested in this general topic, but there are things in this article that I don't need to know. And bearing in mind that the number of articles that we all have to read is huge these days, frequently you don't want to read the entire thing. So if somebody is, let's say we're back to the election. Well, there's an economic aspect, there's a celebrity so maybe you're interested in charisma, you're interested in the celebrity aspect of it. So what you'd like to be able to do is go to that section of the paper, read what is said there, and get on with life. Okay, the opening and closing paragraphs. Okay, I've sort of said this before, but the opening paragraph is basically telling the reader where are we going. It's a map for what's going on and how you're going to get there. It should answer the research question. So essentially you're saying, this is my argument. Now I'm going to show you the evidence. The conclusion repeats the answer. So I began with this argument, I've supported it with this type of material, end of story. As for citations and bibliography, if you're writing a book and you use in-text citations or you use footnotes, most publishers don't care. And speaking as a publisher, you look at a manuscript where maybe you think you would rather have footnotes rather than the in-text citations. But if you try to change it, this is a very long manuscript, it's a book-length manuscript, you're bound to introduce mistakes. So most publishers will say, fine, you use that style, so long as it's done right, we're happy with it. Journal articles, though, journals will have a house style, and you'll need to follow the house style. Your first question is, does the editor require that submissions follow the house style? And some do and some don't. When I was editing the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, I would accept for consideration articles no matter what kind of style they used for the footnotes. If it was accepted, though, they had to follow the house style. And so they would have to change the citations to match the house style. Journals have style sheets. And you can usually find the style sheet online. So just go to the journal website, look at the style sheet. There'll be some explanation as to what they require about a submission, and follow the instructions. Now we come to the literature review. And boy, do people overdo that. They have, okay, first of all, when you're writing a dissertation, part of the job is to prove that you have mastered the literature. So you have a long section where you explain things that are not your thinking at all. They're just what the other people have said. And all you're trying to do is show your supervisor, yes, I have learned this, I have absorbed it. You don't do this in your article. You're just repeating what other people have discovered, what other people have said, and you need to do a little bit of that to show where what you're doing fits in. But your article is basically your data, your analysis. When you do the literature review, it's smarter to discuss ideas rather than sources. So you see literature reviews where you say, this author says this author says this author says this. Well, you'd be better off with something not like that, but rather you say, focus on an idea. So just to give you an example, the focus of studies on nationalism has shifted from ideology and group loyalty to print capitalism. And then you cite Benedict Anderson. So you're focusing on an idea and then you're giving the source, rather than focusing on the source and then talking about the idea. And you limit the literature review to the concepts and the sources that are directly relevant to what you're doing. When I started out, the way you published something was you sent an article in, you got a letter back saying it's rejected or it's accepted. They published it, and that was about it. We didn't have abstracts, we certainly didn't have keywords, and we didn't sign any releases or contracts, and all of that has changed. Most journals now will send you a document that you have to sign, which basically authorizes the journal to publish your material. And it also clarifies what the copyright situation is. Now, there are two options that journals will generally use. Some journals will say you need to transfer the copyright to the journal. Others will say you keep the copyright, but you give the publisher of the journal exclusive rights to produce that article. You probably will not get published in the standard series of journals without doing that. There's a change now because of open access, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So what can you do in terms of making the article available, of getting feedback? Well, most journals will say you can post the final draft of your article on your personal website, on a university repository, or even on something like Academia EDU. And then they will lay it out, and they will produce what's called the version of record. And most journals will not allow you to post the version of record. Now, people do it. And if you do it, you have violated your agreement with the publisher. So it's not a smart thing to do. For open access publications, you have a series of choices, ranging from one that is pretty much similar to the standard copyright, which is the first one I've listed there, the CC BY NC ND, which is anybody using your material has to cite you. It has to have attribution. It cannot be used for commercial purposes, and there can be no derivatives. The most liberal is the CC-BY, where attribution is important, but it allows other people to, quote, remix, tweak, and build upon your material, as long as they credit you for the original creation. Now, in the sciences, this is very useful. Somebody has come up with, done a research experiment, for example, they've come up with new data, and the best thing is for other people to take that data and build on it. In the humanities and social sciences, it's not so good. I'm a historian. I collect data from archives. Now, anybody can go to the archive and get the same material. I have put labor into this, but it's not, I don't have any exclusive claim on that material. It's not like I've done an experiment that nobody's done before. My contribution is the way I assemble that material, my analysis of that material, my interpretation. And I do not want somebody else changing it and putting my name on it. So for me, the one thing that I would use is the most restrictive Creative Commons copyright. Now these are used in open access publications, and there'll be a second part to this presentation where I'm talking about academic publishing. And in that section, I'll deal with open access publications. Okay, there's a number of standard structures for essays. Again, I don't think I need to talk about that right now. Obviously, everything pretty much is built around an introduction, body, and conclusion, but there are variations. And as you're planning your essay, think about some of these variations, some of the possibilities. Now, we come to what happens in Asian writing. And Asian scholarly writing in Asian languages differs from English language scholarship in various ways. And it also is not to say there's a single Asian way of writing. I mean, you look at writing by Chinese scholars, and the first thing they'll tell you is this is not the same, writing in Chinese by Chinese scholars, they'll tell you this is not the same as writing in English. And some of the things that are different are the way the topic is stated, the way an argument is presented, the way a study is justified or otherwise, the way evidence is presented. And a good article in one language will not necessarily be a good article in another language. So I have some points here about the argumentation that are somewhat dictated by cultural features. So a tendency to have an indirect rather than a direct presentation of material. A lot of Asian languages rely heavily on passive voice. And passive voice tells you what happened, it doesn't tell you who did it. So it's indirect. A lot of pieces rely on inductive rather than deductive reasoning. Well, inductive reasoning is where you're starting with your data and then you're coming up with your conclusion. And of course, it's a possible way to present material, but it's not going to go down very well with the editor of a journal because they have to wade through the material, try and figure out what you're doing. The reluctance to criticize other scholars, maybe that's good, maybe not, but it's certainly a feature. Again, a tendency to avoid contentious statements, and so on. You can read them. Now, we talked about this in Indonesia, and there has been some research done by Indonesian scholars about the way Indonesian writers present material. And one of the things that they said was that, generally speaking, Indonesian scholars are responding to practical issues. They're not responding to gaps in the literature. They're not surveying what other people have done and saying, well, here's something nobody has looked at, I'm going to look at that. But rather, they're looking at social issues in Indonesian society and dealing with those things. They do tend to avoid negative evaluations or critiques of other writers. They don't get involved in a lot of arguments. Sometimes they'll restate information from other sources without commenting or taking a position. and they do tend to emphasize group harmony over winning debates. Now, this is an evaluation of Indonesian writing by scholars in Indonesia who have considered what they're doing compared with English language publications. And the reference is there at the foot of the page. Okay, finally, let me just conclude with some general advice. First of all, you need to read and follow journal guidelines. Second, sloppiness in your manuscript. I mean, a lot of grammar and spelling errors. Word will tell you exactly where you've made a mistake. It puts little lines under the words where there's something wrong. So use that feature and try to get your manuscript in the best shape you can. Typographical errors. All of this hurts your chances. Because as an editor, I look at a paper and I say, look, if you don't care enough about your work to make it right, why should I care about it? This also applies to the correspondence you may have with an editor. Be careful with how that's written. Remove the comments and the corrections. If you've used the features of Word where you put in comments or you show the corrections that you have made, I've opened up submissions and I see nothing but a sea of red because the person who sent this in has made a lot of changes. Sometimes you realize they've sent it to other people and they've made changes, but they haven't accepted the changes. And so I'm confronted with this page. Now, of course, I can accept everything and see what's left, but you should do that. So you accept the changes, turn off track changes. Don't bother with fancy typefaces or artistic layouts. First of all, that they use up paper. If we're going to print out a copy, you're just wasting paper. What I would generally do is convert, no matter what you've done, I'll convert everything to 12-point Times New Roman, get rid of all the things you've stuck in there. So don't waste your time. And this is a great mystery. Back in the days of the typewriter, we were all taught if you have a period, a full stop, you put 2 spaces after it. If you have a colon, you put 2 spaces after it. Now, the reason for that was that a typewriter made it a bit, everything in the typewriter was the same space. So whether it's a colon, an I, an N, or an M, it takes up the same amount of space. So it helped understand where sentences began and ended if there was an extra space. The computer will make adjustments for all these things. Computers use what's called proportional spacing, which means that the I takes up less space than the N takes up less space than the M. So don't put in 2 spaces after the period. Don't put in 2 spaces after a colon. I have personally destroyed, literally, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of spaces. Because what I do with the paper is I start off with a global change, and I change 2 spaces to 1 space. And whoosh, they all go. And every time I do this, I sit there thinking, look, somebody has sat there going to put in all those spaces. They probably have carpal tunnel syndrome for putting in those spaces. And I just take care of it. If you have images in your submission, make sure that they're low resolution. Now, if your article's accepted, we'll ask for high resolution images. But if you put an image into a Word document, first of all, it degrades the image. We can't use the image that you put in. And second, it can make the Word document so large that it's hard to handle. So be sure if you're putting an image in, it's a low resolution image. So for the publication, a high resolution image should be sent as a JPEG file. And as a rule of thumb, look for making it 300 dpi. I mean, that's only a very rough gauge, but that will usually do. If you're using tables, charts, and pictures, say from an Excel file and putting them into a Word file, the same thing applies. If you've created a table inside a Word file, that's fine. But what you're doing in the manuscript for the pictures or for tables from an Excel file is you put in a line that says, picture, and give a designation for the picture about here, or table such and such about here. And that will tell the typesetter eventually, you take that table, the file of that table, put it in at that location. Okay, so here's a summary of what is going on for you as an author and for editors. So on the left-hand side are the things that the author needs to do. So you start with a topic which you have to introduce, you have to explain, you have to justify, and you have to position. And then you move on to an argument, and you have to introduce that, explain it, position it, support it with data, and then you have a conclusion. Now that's your job as a writer. The structure of your piece is in the second column. So all those things in the first column you have to do somehow in the context of the things listed there. So you have an introduction. What are you going to put there? Well, you better introduce your topic. You probably need to justify it. You need to introduce your argument. So all those elements go into your introduction. They should go into your abstract as well, and so on. So this is you squeezing all that material in the first column into the sections of the second. The third and fourth columns are about the concerns of the editor. And so, I mean, you can read through them, but there's basically some of the things I've just talked about. The editor is going to look at your topic. And one thing I didn't mention is about the author's credentials. Why should anybody pay attention to you when you're writing about this topic? And the answer may be, I did a PhD on this subject, or I've done a research project on this subject. But the editor really needs to know why you are an authority on the material you've submitted. Okay, then the editor is going to look at the argument, look at the writing, and look at the mechanics. And the last point down there at the bottom of the last column is plagiarism. And I haven't really talked about that, but if we find it, you're dead. You are cooked. And of course, these days there's online software, so we can, if we suspect it, we can probably take a paragraph, plug it into the software, and lo and behold, somebody else has written that same paragraph. Definitely not good. And I guess one thing I should also add, people sometimes ask about dual submissions. Can you submit an article to 2 journals at the same time? And the answer to that is no. What's going to happen in all likelihood is I will write to a referee and say, I've got this article, here's the topic, here's the abstract, would you be interested in refereeing it? And the referee is going to write back and say, whoa, I just got the same request from another journal, same article. So at that point, I write to the editor of the other journal. I say no. The editor of the other journal says no. And we don't forget that you did that. So don't do it. Okay, if you get a copy of this, the PDF, there is a set of references at the back, general references, and then some specific things that we picked up in looking at the Indonesian material, and some general points. So with that, thank you very much.
I think we have some time to take some questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a wireless microphone to you. Well, otherwise, our mentor is with us all throughout the morning. We can have a short 15-minute break. You can talk to him during the break as well. The refreshment is served outside. Please enjoy, and we'll come back in 15 minutes. Thank you.